Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Abraham's test of faith in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1, now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham. We're going to see God telling Abraham to do some things, and it's going to just strike against us. But we're told before we even get there that this was all a test. And so, it's not what it appears. God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take now your son, your only son. Remember, Ishmael is now out of the picture. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Now, notice that he's specifically told to go to the land of Moriah. The next time we see that term Moriah, it will refer not to just a general land, but a specific mountain in an area of the land of Canaan. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1, where Solomon begins to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, that same place where the Lord had appeared to his father David. So Moriah then is going to be the place where the temple is located. Solomon's temple would be built on this very site. Later on, Herod's temple would be built upon this very site. If you go to that site today, you'll find a great structure called the Dome of the Rock. Now, this is a Muslim structure. I'm not Muslim, but it commemorates a number of things, including the sacrifice that Abraham was told to make upon the top of this mountain. Genesis 22:3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. It's interesting that the 3rd day is mentioned. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there. Now, you know what Abraham's already been told to do. But notice what he says, and we will worship and return to you. And actually, it's clearer in the Hebrew text than it is in the English. We will worship and we will return to you. Abraham, he's being told to go and sacrifice his son, and yet somehow he knows that this is the son of promise and that both he will return and his son will return too. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? We've forgotten something, Dad. And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And so the 2 of them walked on together. Now there's a wonderful contrast that we see in this story. As we look at Isaac, he's going to be offered as a sacrifice to God. At least that's the intent of which Abraham has been told. And Jesus, who himself was offered as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. In Isaac's case, he's taken to Mount Moriah, outside the ancient city of Jerusalem. In the case of Jesus, he's taken to a place called Golgotha, the skull, but it's also outside the city of Jerusalem. In Isaac's case, he carries the wood for the sacrifice up the mountain. And if you remember, in Jesus' case, he carried his own cross for his crucifixion up the mountain. Isaac was bound and laid upon the altar. Jesus was nailed to the cross. For 3 days, Abraham and Isaac are going to be traveling to Moriah, this place of death. And Jesus, for 3 days after his crucifixion, would be in the grave, but then after that he would rise again from the dead. Verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told them, this very special place. And Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. And here's the part where it gets serious. And he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. We're not told about anybody's reaction. It's just simple language of what's taking place. Verse 10, Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. It's interesting how it's said twice, the force of it. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Notice God says, you haven't withheld your son, your only son. And what God had told Abraham to do and yet stopped him, God is going to continue to do with his own son, with Jesus, by sending him to the earth, and nobody is going to stop Jesus from going to the cross. Indeed, Jesus will pray to the Father, if there's any way this can pass from me, and yet not my will, but thine. And in the end, he will go to the cross. Well, in Abraham's case, Abraham raised his eyes and he looked. That's going to be significant here to the wordplay that follows. He looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. So this ram becomes the substitute for his son. The ram's going to die instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. However, I have a little bit of a problem with that word provide. Certainly the idea is there, but that's actually not what that Hebrew word means. When I look at that word provide, it's the Hebrew word yirah, from the word ra'ah, to see. The same word where Abraham raised his eyes and looked. And so, or Abraham raised his eyes and saw. And so the name of that place is the Lord will see. Now, of course, if you see it, that means it's been provided. So the idea is there, but I want you to see the connection of what Abraham had done and what God is doing. God will see. That is, it's going to be seen, as it is said to this day, in the mountain of the Lord it will be seen. The Hebrew text says. Provided is okay, it gets that idea, but don't miss the connection with the previous verse. As a result of the anguish of his soul, Isaiah chapter 53 verse 11 tells us, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. It's a picture of what Christ would do for us, and how he would die in our place to justify the many as he bears our iniquities. One more New Testament passage this time. There, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. We are to look as well. In the same way Abraham looked and saw the ram, in the way God saw and provided, we are to see the one who has been provided for us, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. If you see him through the eyes of faith, you will be saved.